People probably have not heard of the JP2 MRI. And in fact, people in Iowa City frequently, when I talk to them, also have not ever heard of JP2 MRI. Until recently, when the ice bucket phenomena occurred this summer, that was the first time that Iowans and people around the globe first heard about our organization. We're an early stage nonprofit organization, and often one of the questions that we get is who are we and why we were created. So what I'm going to do is to kind of speak to you today about our organization, why the Institute was created, and give you sort of a background and a rationale for it. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I'm outlining here, is the historical track record of human subject research, and this is particularly important in terms of the medical ethics of how it pertains to stem cell research. And then the historical timeline of embryonic stem cell research. And then I'm going to break into the next section, what are the challenges in medical research and drug development, because as physicians and scientists and taking care of patients, we want to know how do we develop cures for a variety of different ailments. And since we're focused on adult stem cell research, we want to know where does the government stand in terms of its leadership in adult stem cell research. And then as a backdrop, what is the mission of the Institute and what's our status, where are we now in terms of the science, and how do we differentiate ourselves from other nonprofits. So in terms of the background introduction into human subject research. You have to go back to World War II, and many of you probably are very familiar with the Nuremberg trials. So in the Nuremberg trials, one of the things that occurred was the doctor trial, in which a handful of German doctors were put on trial against the crimes of humanity, and this was the USA versus the Karl Brandt trial. Karl Brandt was the personal physician of Adolf Hitler. And these German physicians conducted a euthanasia program where they performed a systematic killing of those who they deemed unworthy of life. And so many of these victims were the mentally and physically disabled. And these German physicians and scientists conducted pseudoscientific medical experiments on concentration camp victims, and these were often Jews, Poles, the mentally and the physically disabled, and also prisoners as the Russians, and they also did experiments on the gypsies. So, and obviously they did this without their consent. And so 16 of these doctors were then found guilty, and 7 were executed. So many of us know that story, but what seems to be often ignored and sort of interpreted historically about this trial was that these were simply crazy Nazis, and that the environment that was created by the Nazi allowed this to occur. But what seems to be often ignored was that this was simply, there was a condition way prior to the Nazi acquiring power that led to this issue. In Germany, in World War I, there was a very prevalent euthanasia culture among the elite, the academia. So, for example, during World War I, 140,000 people died in German psychiatric asylums through neglect. And so keep in mind, what was Germany at the time? It was perhaps one of the best recognized medical organizations at the time. They had some of the best institutes, the best medicine. They were really, and it also was a Christian nation. So that is, historically, that's a very scary situation. So when the National Socialist Party came into power, they promptly developed 2 codified programs into law. a sterilization program, and an authorized euthanasia program. And so it was very common among the German academicians and the philosophers to tout that those suffering from illness represented a restriction of the individual capacity to perform for society. And that society had the right to kill those who they felt were suffering, and society had more rights than the individual. And often this was couched in compassionate terms to relieve that person's suffering. So what was often ignored from the lesson of history from the Nuremberg trial was that the record shows that in academia, in the Third Reich, there were often eager recruits from academia who found this concept that life is unworthy of life and its deliberate pursuit was founded in academia. So the environment was very accepted and poised to allow the crimes during World War II. So as a result of the Nuremberg trial, the first medical ethics code was adopted. And this is a very long code, and I've just highlighted the most important points here. So the Nuremberg Code said for human subject research, there has to be a free and voluntary consent. There has to be informed consent of the benefits and the risks of the experiment. The experiment should result in very fruitful results for the good of society and not obtained by some other means that are unnecessary. The experiment should be designed based on the results of animal experimentation and the natural knowledge of the disease. And the experiment should avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury and death. Now, there are some weaknesses of the Nuremberg Code, and there was an omission of any language that stated that protections for vulnerable groups and any language that implicated that human subject rights trump the arguments that the benefits of society were more important. So now 20 years later, the World Medical Association adopted, reaffirmed the Nuremberg trial, the Nuremberg Code. And so there are, this is 20 years later, and what they did, they made inserted some additional language that was important. First, they said that the interest of society, the interest of science and society should never take precedence over the considerations related to the well-being of the subject. So that was an important step that they took beyond what the Nuremberg Code stated. Now, they did have one particular weakness. They made no specific reference to the protection of vulnerable groups. So, at the time in the United States, this is back in the 60s, it was sort of the common belief among the medical society that the problems that occurred during World War II, this was really an isolated German and European problem. And there was a feeling that this was not a problem in the United States. Well then, in 1966, a very prominent anesthesiologist and academician by the name of Dr. Henry Beecher published a report in the New England Journal of Medicine titled The Ethics of Clinical Research. And what he did was that he investigated and exposed basically 22 examples of unethical research conducted in the United States. And as an example, he reported a case where mentally disabled children in a state school were infected with hepatitis virus. And the principal investigator rationalized that by doing this, he could provide a cure for the treatment of hepatitis, which would provide a greater benefit to society. And interestingly, this physician, this pediatrician, and eventually went on to become a chairman of a leading department in pediatrics. But as a result of this, publication and Dr. Beecher's stature, the National Institute of Health then convened an independent institutional review board to review all the human subject research, and shortly thereafter the FDA adopted these guidelines that all human subject research had to be conducted under a IRB or an institutional review board. But and like many things in life, there's a difference between laws and enforcements in practice. So in the 1970s, what came to light was the Tuskegee syphilis study, and I don't know if many of you have ever heard of that. But this was a study conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service between 1932 and 1972. And they were charged to examine the long-term effects of syphilis. So what they did is they studied 400 African American males who were primarily poor sharecroppers, and all these men had syphilis, but were unaware of that they had contracted this disease. So what was very horrifying at the time was in 1950, penicillin was proved to be effective against syphilis, but the researchers decided not to treat these men, and they went as far to prevent other doctors who saw these participants and prevented them from treating syphilis. So many of these men went on to develop some of the late-term complications of syphilis, and as 100 men died from the complications of syphilis from being untreated. So this came out in 1972, the project was shut down. And as a result of this incident, Congress passed the National Research Act of 1974. And interestingly, this is a year after Roe v. Wade. So the National Research Act of 1974 created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And it provided the first law for providing the guidelines for conducting human subject research. So there are really four major principles. The number one principle is the respect for persons, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. They should have, those with diminished autonomy are still entitled to special protection. The second concept is beneficence. Do no harm and maximize the possible benefits and minimize harm. And then lastly is the justice. Now, who should receive the benefits of research and who bears the burdens? So as an example of an injustice occurs when the benefits in which a person is entitled is denied without good reason, or when some burden is imposed unduly. It also clearly stated that individuals with a lower capacity for making decisions, such as the children, the elderly, and the developmentally disabled, needed special protections. As you can see, how this is starting to encroach on in the future for fetal and embryonic stem cell research.